The Lord be with you. I've changed out the gospel reading today in favour of an event I witnessed on October 17th this year up near my home, and so this is a record of it. I've been watching her carefully for quite some time now, and she hasn't moved a single muscle. She sits absolutely still in a full lotus position with the soles of her feet resting atop her thighs. Her spine is erect and she demonstrates perfect mudras and asanas. I'm trying to stay perfectly still myself as I witness her state of samadhi. I confess that I smile a little when a little bird lands on her shoulder, cocks his head sideways, and then squirts white guano down her back. She still doesn't move. How deep can she be? I soon find out. A tiny lizard, no longer than 2 inches, is scaling up her arm and soon attaches himself to her left breast. He too cocks his head sideways to study her profile. She still doesn't flinch. Now I'm really impressed. From my rough-hewn redwood log bench, I study the serenity of her face. Her eyes are closed as she looks deeply into the core of the oneness. What is she experiencing? Is there even a she? Or am I in the presence of pure awareness in which there is neither observer nor observed? But my time is up. I need to drive back to Palo Alto for Mass tomorrow morning. So I stand silently, bow, and offer her namaste, this stone carving of Tara, which graces the sacred mount near my home that I call Cnochán Dara Na Naomh, the hillock of the oak tree of the avatars. I've just had a realization. The official seat of the High Kings of Ireland, long before Patrick brought Christianity to the Irish, was called the Hill of Tara. Is it possible that this bodhisattva of compassion, Tara, once lived on another hillock before she came to mine? Was pre-Celtic Christ consciousness birthed from the womb of a Buddhist goddess? A word inspired by God. How many people have the chutzpah to start writing their autobiography at age 31? Thomas Merton did, except he did it under his vow of obedience. So Thomas Merton was actually a very, very well-known writer in the early 1900s. Very, very well known. Even as a young man, by age 23, he'd already established quite a reputation for himself as a writer. And that was the age at which he converted to Roman Catholicism. And at age 31, he entered the monastery of Gethsemane in Kentucky in order to become a Trappist monk. And the abbot put him under obedience to write his autobiography. So he started writing his autobiography at age 31. And for whatever reason, it became an instant bestseller. And he titled it was called The Seven Storey Mountain. And it sold eventually over 3 million copies. It got translated into 15 different languages. So this morning, I don't want to talk about the Seven Storey Mountain. The story is, the referenced Seven Storey Mountain is to Dante's Divine Comedy, in which he talks about the mountain of purgatory with the 7 stages of it. So that was the reference. This morning, I don't want to do a 7-story mountain. I want to do 7 stories about 7 different mountains. And I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll go for it. So it's basically today is a kind of a storytelling session. And the first one will be the story of Grant's Hill. The second one will be the story of Mount Moriah. The third one will be the story of Mount Sinai. The fourth will be the story of Mount Tabor. The fifth will be the story of the Hill of Gethsemane, or Calvary. The sixth will be the story of the Hill of Tara. And the seventh will be the story of the other Hill of Tara. Okay? So they're the 7 stories for this morning. So the first one, the story of Grant's Hill. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie. It was made in 1995 called The Englishman Who Went Up a Hill and Came Down a Mountain. Yes. Have you seen that story? Okay, it's a brilliant story. Starring Hugh Grant and an Irish a guy called Colm Meaney. And it's basically a story that was set in 1917. So it's the middle of the First World War. And two British cartographers are attempting to map the terrain. And they want to distinguish between where England ends and where Wales begins. And they've come to an arbitrary decision. The decision is that England will end and Wales will begin where they find the first mountain on their journey to the west. And they've defined a mountain as anything of 1,000 feet elevation or over. So just pick a number out of a hat, and this is the decision. So they come to this little village, which is Welsh speaking. And they're staying in a little hotelly there, and their objective is to measure the elevation to the mountain. And the word gets out. If it's under 1,000 feet, it's going to become part of England. And these guys, these Welsh-speaking guys, under no circumstances do they want to be regarded as English or be part of England. So there's consternation. So everybody is biting their nails. For the 2 or 3 weeks, these two cartographers are trying to measure the elevation to the mountain. And the bad news is, it worked out at 970 feet elevation. So there's pandemonium in the village. So they organize themselves, and they ask the two cartographers to wait a little bit because they think their measurements might be wrong. In the meantime, they organize a posse. The entire village turns out over the next 2 weeks, and they start schlepping stones and stuff up to the top of the mountain, and they build this cairn which is 35 feet high. And they strip, the most precious thing in Wales, in any village in Wales, is their rugby field. They even strip the rugby field of the sod, and they carry that up, and they plaster it over the stones to make it look like a real hill. And they invited the cartographers to go back up and remeasure it, and it turned out to be 1,005 feet. So they got to be Welsh after all. It's a brilliant movie. So that's the first story. The second story is the story of Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah is 2,428 feet elevation. And it's the place where Abraham was being asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. So let me just give you the background, the historical background, or the biblical background to it. Abraham was born in a place called Ur of the Chaldees. Ur of the Chaldees is modern-day Iraq. And his father was an idol maker. He was to make images for the gods, for the religions of the area. But all of a sudden, Abraham has a vision in which a particular god called Yahweh invites him to leave his home and to travel towards the west, and that he was going to give him his own patrimony in a new land. Now, Abraham was not a monotheist by any manner of means. Even at the end of his life, he was not a monotheist. But among all the gods, this particular god called Yahweh was saying, I want to make a particular agreement with you. And so he follows him out west into a land, except the land is inhabited, obviously. And Abraham's wife is Sarah, but she's barren, she can't have kids. And she's now in her 90s and long, long beyond childbearing age. But Abraham has a visit, 2 messengers from this god come, and they promise that his wife is going to get pregnant. And she's sitting inside in the tent listening to this, and she starts laughing. And they say to her, why did your wife laugh? And she sticks her head out and says, I wasn't laughing, I had phlegm in my throat, I was coughing. And a year later, she has a son. And she called him Itzach, which means he's laughing. That's what the name means. And God had promised him that he was going to make Abraham the father of a great nation. He says, he took him out at night and he said, look at the stars of the heaven. Your progeny will be more numerous than the stars in the sky, or the grains of sand on the beach. So he's got this just one son. Now, in actual fact, he had another son, but it wasn't by Sarah. At one stage, Sarah was so anxious to have some kind of issue that she gave her slave girl Hagar, who was an Egyptian slave, to Abraham and said, have a child with her and it'll legally be my child because she's my slave, I own her. And so he actually had an older son called Ishmael, who became the father of the Islamic people, or the Muslim peoples. But it really didn't count because it wasn't really Sarah's biological child. But now the biological child had arrived and she was really, really, really happy. And then the child is about 12 years old and he has his first safari with Daddy. And Daddy has been told by God that he wants Abraham to kill the kid. Now, at this stage, child sacrifice was quite common. the gods of the time, needed sacrifice, and they were very, very happy. Particularly, they liked firstborns. I only barely escaped with my life myself. They really had a predilection for firstborns. When the gods of the time went into a restaurant, they'd look at the menu and they'd say, any firstborns on the menu today? So they really liked firstborns. So the God wants the firstborn. So Abram sets out on a journey to Mount Moriah, where he's going to do the sacrifice. And he's got two of his servants with him, and the little boy is dancing around beside Daddy. He's really, really happy. This is his first journey with Daddy. He's a real boy now. And at some stage, Abram sends the two servants back, and he says, my son and I are going to go on alone. And the kid is really, really happy. And he says, Daddy, didn't you forget something? We have the wood for the sacrifice, and we've got the fire for the sacrifice, and you've got the knife for the sacrifice, but where's the sacrifice? And Abram has a lump in his throat and says, son, God himself will provide the sacrifice. And it's going to be you. He didn't say that, obviously. So the kid is real happy. But they get to Mount Moriah, and he binds the child, ties up the child, makes an altar, puts the child on the altar, puts the wood underneath him, and then takes out his dagger to kill him. And all of a sudden, an angel stays his hand. And allegedly, God says, I was just testing your faith. And he looks around, and there's a ram caught in a thicket. So he slaughters the ram instead. So he's thinking, hey, when I said God himself would provide the sacrifice, I didn't really realize, how prophetic I was being. Now, Christians would take it another 1850 years later and say, it wasn't about the ram in the thicket, it was about the Lamb of God, Jesus. But that's one of the other stories. And so he unbinds the child, and he brings the child home. Now, you can imagine at some stage, Sarah finds out. How do you think she reacted? You dumbass Egypt, what were you thinking about? You told me that we were going to be the progenitors of the stars of the heavens and the sands and the shore of the sea, and we have one son, and you were going to kill him? What in God's name are you thinking about? What kind of a mishegas is this? What kind of a God are you following anyway? Let's get a different God. This is a crazy God. Isaac, come over here. Don't ever, ever go out with your father alone again. So that's the second story. The third story is Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai is in the Arabian Peninsula, and this is a real mountain. The others are piddling little things, 2,428 feet. This one is 7,497 feet, Mount Sinai. And the greatness of Mount Sinai is that this is where really the Israelites bonded as a nation for the first time. So backtrack a little bit. In the year 1700 BC, the descendants of Abram and Isaac and Jacob were forced down into the land of Egypt because of a famine in the land, which the God had told them would be a land flowing with milk and honey. But this land flowing with milk and honey underwent regular famines, in which case they had to emigrate temporarily. So the entire family emigrates down to the land of Egypt in the year 1700 BC. And initially they're getting on really, really well. They're well taken care of. But then they're enslaved, and they're enslaved for 450 years. And so in the year 1250 BC comes this charismatic character called Moses, who's going to set the Israelites free. And after they've begun the Exodus, they're really a ragtag group. They weren't even all Israelites. They weren't even all descendants of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. They were a total ragtag group of escaped slaves. And so Moses needed to try to lick them into shape in some form. And so he goes up onto Mount Sinai, and he has a meeting with this God. Now, even Moses is not a monotheist. Monotheism does not come into Judaism until about the year 700 BC. So Moses is not a monotheist. In fact, Moses didn't even recognize this God when this God wanted to send him back to the land of Egypt to set the Israelites free. And he finally asked this God, I don't even know who you are. Who are you? What's your name? And God more or less tells him, mind your own business. God said to him, Ehiyah Ashir Ehiyah. I will be whoever the hell I want to be. That's basically what it means. It's always mistranslated into English as, I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am in Hebrew. You have to get around it by a device which is called predication without a verb. And we have the same issue in Swahili. You cannot say I am in Swahili. You get around it by a device called predication without a verb. So if I want to say in Swahili, for instance, I am a man. In English, it sounds like I am a man. In Swahili is mimi mwanaume. Me, man. But there's no present tense of the verb to be. There's the present tense of all the other verbs, and there are all the other tenses of the verb to be, but not the present tense. Same in Hebrew. If you're going to say in Hebrew, I am the king, you will say, Ani melech, me king. So there's no connector in the present tense. So God did not say, I am who I am, or I am that I am. He used a future tense in Hebrew. He said, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I will be who I will be. In other words, it's none of your bloody business what my name is. I'm telling you what to do. You go do it. So, but Moses had no idea who this God was. But anyway, the Exodus is happening, and they're crossing the desert, and they're this totally ragtag mob. And Moses desperately needs some kind of a constitution for them. So the first constitutional congress was held, on the top of Mount Sinai, 7,497 feet. And there were two parties to it. There was Moses, and there was this God called Yahweh. And they set out the terms of the agreement. And the terms of the agreement were, God, Yahweh, was insisting on 613 conditions. It was a fairly, a big document. 613 conditions. And the result was, from the other side, they would get to inhabit this new land. And it would be theirs in perpetuity. Now, this promise by God was pathetic because he never kept it. When you look at Jewish history, over 70% of the time, this land of theirs was conquered by colonialists, or they were sent into exile. They only inhabited for about less than 25% of the time. So this God wasn't able to deliver on his promise. But he insisted that they keep the 613 precepts of this new agreement. And so it really was the first kind of constitutional congress where they're working out some kind of a modus vivendi that these ragtag mob can kind of bind them together in some kind of a confederation. So the greatness of Mount Sinai is not that just God gave Moses 2 stone tablets with 10 commandments. That's the cliff notes. There were 613. And so it really was the beginning of the family of the Israelites, in some sense, coming from the Exodus experience, where they were from many different groupings, different slaves who'd been living in Egypt at the same time, and all escaped at the same time. So the story of Mount Sinai is the story of a nation in its birthing process, a confederation of peoples becoming a unified group for the first time. That's the third story. The fourth story is the story of Mount Tabor. And Mount Tabor is, as mountains go, pretty small. It's 1,738 feet high. And the story behind this, you all know it from your New Testament, was that on the week before he died, Jesus took 3 of his 12 disciples, Peter, James, and John, and he took them on top of this, and it says in the New Testament, high mountain. It's not really high. It's 1,738. If you're living in the lowlands, maybe it looks high, but it's not a high mountain. And they go up to the top of the mountain, and Jesus has this extraordinary experience. He has some kind of a visionary experience, and the vision is so intense that it actually manifests in physical form. And Moses and Elijah appear with him. Now, Moses had died in the year 1210 BC, so literally 1,200 years before Jesus was born. And Elijah had died about 800 years before Jesus was born. But here are they now, so visible that the 3 disciples can also, see what's happening here. So this has always fascinated me. Was this just, obviously this wasn't just some kind of an interior vision that Christ was having in his own mind, but it was so powerful an experience that it actually got to be articulated or manifested in such a way that the other 3 could actually witness what was happening. So how do you explain something like that? Is it one of these kind of made-up stories that you find in scriptural traditions all over the world? Or is there more to reality than we give it credit for? So, for instance, how do you define a miracle? I don't believe in miracles, personally. If by miracle you mean that God temporarily changes the rules of the cosmos in order to indulge the prayers of holy people, I don't believe in miracles. But I do believe in miracles in the sense that the universe is much, much more complex and much more beautiful than we have understood in our science or even in our spirituality. And that the great avatars and the great bodhisattvas, they have learned how the cosmos works. And the Greeks there's 2 words for cosmos in Greek, one spelled with a C and one spelled with a K. When cosmos is spelled with a C, it means the physical universe in which we find ourselves. When it's spelled with a K, it means the metaphysical originator of which the physical cosmos is merely a manifestation. And so the avatars and the bodhisattvas and the great spiritual teachers like Jesus, they're ones who understand much, much more deeply how the cosmos really works. And because they know how it works, they can make it do things that the rest of us aren't able to do. So what was happening in this experience for Jesus? And my hit on it is this: that Jesus was either time traveling and bringing the guys with him in the process. So he was either going back 800 years, picking up Elijah on the road, and then inviting Elijah to go back another 450 years with him, and now they're encountering Moses as well. And so he's time traveling himself, his group. He's picking up on the way Elijah, and he's taking him back further to the time of Moses, and they're having a conference. Or he goes back to the time of Moses, and he brings Moses forward, and he picks up Elijah on the road, and he brings him right up to the time of the disciples, and they have a conference on the mountaintop. And the object of the conference is, it's practical and it's symbolic, because Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets, and the Hebrew scriptures consist of 3 parts. They're called Tanakh. Tanakh means the Torah, the Nebi'im, and the Ketubim. Torah means the law given by Moses. Nebi'im means the prophets. Nebi'im are the plural word in Hebrew for prophets. And in Swahili it's the same word. Nabi is the word in Swahili for a prophet. And then Ketubim are the writings, which is interesting. In Swahili, the word for a book is kitabu. So kitabu and Ketubim are Swahili, Arabic, and Hebrew as well. And so the Hebrew scriptures consist of 3 parts. The law, the prophets, and the writings. So here is Jesus, now meeting 2 of the kind of the authors, or 2 of the kind of the representatives, or the icons, or the symbols for the law and for the prophets. And they're having this conference together. Now, so what it represents for me is the extraordinary ability resident in these great spiritual teachers and nascently present in every single one of us. The ability to time travel, for instance, the ability for telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, psychokinesis, all of these things are part of what it means to be a human person, but they've lain dormant, they haven't been developed. And all the great spiritual traditions teach us they can be developed. Hinduism particularly is very, very strong in it, and they say that they call them the siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I, and the siddhis are the psychic gifts that get manifested in the process of the movement towards enlightenment. And as you acquire particular stages of enlightenment, you begin to manifest these different kinds of gifts. But they warn that these gifts are, can be very seductive, and they can sidetrack people from the journey. It's not about acquiring these gifts. These are just kind of collateral damage to the journey into enlightenment. But certainly the story of Mount Tabor is a story of Jesus understanding how the cosmos works in an extraordinary way, so powerfully that he's either able to take the guys back in time, or he's able to take Moses and Elijah forward in time and have a conference in which they're discussing what his mission is and what the final outcome, because within 1 week he's going to be dead. Which brings me to the 5th story. It's the story of the Hill of Gethsemane, or the Hill of Calvary, whatever word you want to give to it. And it's interesting, Calvary is exactly the same altitude as Moriah. The Mount Moriah is 2,424 feet, for the simple reason that Mount Moriah subsequently became Jerusalem. Mount Moriah of 1850 BC and the time of Abraham became the city of Jerusalem at some stage, and the actual temple. Ron talked about the Second Temple this morning, which was built in 1515 BC and destroyed in 70 AD. The first temple was built in about 950 BC by Solomon, and it was built right on top of Mount Moriah. And so sometimes Mount Moriah is called the Temple Mount. And so within 300 yards of that Temple Mount is Gethsemane, where Jesus dies on the cross. So now you've got this story, which has been, I believe, really misunderstood by Christianity. So in Mount Moriah, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son, certainly the only son of Sarah. And then repented and recanted and said, no, I don't want you to do it. I was just testing your faith. Jesus isn't so lucky. The Christian story is that God went ahead and did sacrifice his only son in a very, very bloodthirsty manner. Much more cruelly than what Abraham intended to do. Abraham intended just cutting his son's throat, and it would have been over and done with in 35 seconds. Jesus was going to hang on a cross for at least 3 hours, having been scourged beforehand. So this God, that Christianity proposes so very often, as our Father, is anything but a loving Father. If God had a wife, there's no way she would have allowed this to happen. There's not a chance in hell that Jesus would have wound up in Calvary if God was married. But this is not the story. This is not a story about Jesus dying for our sins. This is a story about an avatar who lives lucidly, who dreams lucidly, as in Tabor, and who dies lucidly. So with full consciousness, letting go in full consciousness. It is the story of a lifetime lived totally in compassion and love, with total awareness So it's a life lived lucidly, in which every moment of his waking consciousness was dedicated to a mission of healing and love. And Tabor was an example of Jesus dreaming lucidly, dreaming so powerfully that he could actually manifest it and make the dream, available to the audience, and time travel in the process. And Calvary is the story of Jesus showing how to die lucidly, into the realization that there is a way of dying with full consciousness, a way in which our preoccupation is not with the individual self, but rather with the source from which we come. And so at the end of every lifetime, even if you believe in reincarnation, the spiritual literature tells us again and again and again that at the moment of death, every single one of us has the option of merging totally with God. So why wouldn't we do it? Because the cost is you have to totally relinquish any notion of separate identity. The ego has to go, even the soul has to go, because the soul itself is an illusion. The soul is the first illusion on the journey out from God, and the last illusion on the way back into God. Because the truth is, there is only God, and everything else, are dreams that God is having. And so life is a dream that the ego is having, and the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that source is having. So we live in nested dreams, but it's God's dream. It's God playing all the parts. And the invitation of Calvary and the invitation of our death, every death, is the invitation to let go completely of the notion of a separate self and therefore be swept up back into source. Now, there's only two reasons then why we find ourselves on planet Earth. One reason, the most common reason, is we were not prepared to pay that cost at the end of our last death, and so we opted to reincarnate. And then there's the few souls, like the Buddha figure or the Jesus figures, who came back not because they were afraid of letting go and merging with God, but because they had taken a bodhisattva vow to keep reincarnating until every sentient being wakes up and realizes that there is only God. And so Calvary is the bodhisattva in spades. It's the total ability to relinquish the self and to die as lucidly and as compassionately as he had lived. So for me, that's the great story of Calvary. The sixth story then would be the story of the Hill of Tara. There's a little hillock in County Meath in Ireland, which is only 646 feet high. It's called the Hill of Tara. And according to Irish mythology, in the year 432 AD, St. Patrick came to Ireland, and the Hill of Tara was the residence of the High King of Ireland. And at the time of Patrick, the king was called Laira, who's a direct ancestor of mine. My name descends from that same. So Laira was the High King of Ireland at the time. And while he never converted to Christianity himself, he gave Patrick full permission to travel Ireland, and to convert the Irish, anybody who wanted to be converted. But Patrick has this encounter with Laira on the Hill of Tara in the year 432. Now, Tara goes way, way back, much, much, much further. It goes back further than Calvary. It goes back further than Sinai. It goes back further even than Mount Moriah. There are underground passage tombs near Tara which have been dated to 3,400 BC. So we're talking about over 5,500 years old. And it was the seat of the High Kings of Ireland, going back to the time of, even before the Celts, to the time of what we call in Irish mythology, the Cnochán Dara Na Naomh, the people of the goddess Dana. And when they were finally defeated in two great battles at Moriah, they shape-shifted and became the fairy folk of Ireland, and they went underground. They literally went underground. There was an agreement made between the conquerors and the conquered that they would divide the land of Ireland into two pieces, two equal pieces. That the conquerors would have the land, would possess Ireland above the land, and the Cnochán Dara Na Naomh would possess Ireland below the surface. So they lived underground. So the Cnochán Dara Na Naomh lived there by 3,400 BC, maybe earlier. Buildings go back to then. And on the top of it is a very interesting stone. In Gaelic it is called the Lia Foil. And Lia Foil literally means the stone of destiny. And this was the stone where the High Kings of Ireland were crowned as kings, and there was a whole ceremony. And among the contestants to be High King of Ireland It was the stone that decided. So this huge big standing stone is still there today. As the contestants came forward, when the person who was really meant to be the High King touched it, the stone would scream out 3 times. And so the stone chose the person who was to be the High King. And then there was a ceremony of ale drinking. It's Ireland, there has to be some kind of alcohol involved. And the High King to be had to symbolically marry the Irish goddess Maeve. And it was that ceremonial blending of the masculine and the feminine that conferred the high kingship on the king. So that goes way, 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 way back before Patrick. Now, interestingly, at the very beginning of the 1900s, around 1904, 1905, etc., a bunch of English archaeologists came to the Hill of Tara because they had a theory that the Hill of Tara, that the Irish were actually one of the lost tribes of Israel. So when you read the history of Israel, there were 12 tribes in Israel. But in the year 721 BC, 10 of them are taken off into exile by the Assyrian Empire, and they're destroyed. They are never heard of again. They disappear completely. So only 2 tribes left. And the last 2 tribes are taken into exile in Babylon in the year 587 BC. They survive and they come back to the land of Israel. But the 10 other tribes are lost completely. So this group of archaeologists had a belief system that the Irish were actually one of the 10 lost tribes. And the connection was, Tara and Torah. So the words were really, really close, Torah being the law. So they were convinced that the Ark of the Covenant was actually buried under the Hill of Tara. So they excavated there in the early 1900s. They didn't find it, obviously. So it's always been a place of extraordinary kind of pilgrimage. My father was an archaeologist, and he claims he had a special interest in what is called archaeoastrology, which is the effect that the astronomical signs have on human constructions. And so there's a passage tomb in this area which is much, much older than the pyramids themselves. And he was to claim that it was the oldest astrologically oriented human building on planet Earth. And it's oriented to the winter solstice, and you can still visit it. There's a passage tomb that goes deep, deep underground, and on the winter solstice every year, the sunrise sends a streak of light right down this long cavern and hits a designated spot on the back wall. So he claimed it was the oldest astrologically oriented human construction of all time. So there's been a fascination about the Hill of Tara. That's story number 6. And the final story is, and this is part of what I wrote about on October the 17th. When I started building my home in Healdsburg, I've been living up there since 1994. I lived in a little cabin for the first 11 years, and then I set about, building a real house for myself. And so 1 year I put in a septic system, the second year I put in a water system, third year I put in a solar system, and then I started building my house in 2004. But in order to provide a building platform, because it was a total hilltop, I had to excavate, bring in a big D8 caterpillar and excavate a place to actually have a building pad. But I left a hillock there, not thinking about it at the time. And at the top of this hillock is a little a scrub oak. And many of you have been in my home, you've seen this tree. Now, as oak trees go, scrub oak is not that lordly, but this scrub oak has a very, very special energy for me. And so I have a system for myself where every evening I do a little pilgrimage route, about a third of a mile, and I have stationed the 23 stations of the cosmos, the ones that we use in our liturgy, the 23 prayers that we use in our liturgy. I have little posts with bells on it, and I circumambulate that in the evening, and it winds up on top of that hillock. And I've called that hillock in Gaelic, the term I have for it is Cnochán Dara Na Naomh. Cnochán means a hillock, Dara it means an oak tree, and Naomh is saints or avatars. And around that hillock, I've positioned particular kinds of icons. So when you get up there first, there's an icon of Krishna, representing Hinduism, and then there's one representing Islam, and then one representing Judaism, then one representing Christianity, then one representing Buddhism, and then in the center there's an Inukshuk, which is Native American Indian, Inuit, a stone building. And at the very core of it is the tree with the Madonna and child hanging on it. And that's where I had this experience on the 17th. I'm sitting, I have a redwood carved out bench, I'm sitting there and I'm watching this figurine of Tara, who is the Tibetan Buddhist goddess of compassion. I'm sitting there watching, and she's sitting in full lotus, and all of a sudden this little bird just perches, on her shoulder and just squirts iguana down her back. And Tara doesn't flinch. And then a few minutes later, this little lizard crawls up along her left arm and right across onto her breast, and she still doesn't budge. And so I'm looking at this extraordinary samadhi set in stone, and all of a sudden I realize her name is Tara. And I begin to think, my God, and there's the Hill of Tara, and I have this sudden insight, what if life is not just panspermia, this belief system that all life comes from a single source that scientists call panspermia? What if there is something called Pan-Anima, that there is only one soul, and that this soul, manifests occasionally into different kinds of avatars? And what if, for instance, that the reason that Jesus had such access to Moses and Elijah was that Jesus was Moses, and Jesus was Elijah, and Jesus was the Buddha? And what if the female kind of aspect of that was that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had been Maeve, the Irish goddess, or if she had been Tara, or if she had been Kuan Yin for the Chinese Buddhism? What if Mary had played all these roles? What if there's a female archetype and a male archetype, and they just keep manifesting in different forms? So what if this little statuette of Tara on my little mountain, which is only 930 feet high, what if it's a stone version of the soul, of the feminine face of God? And that very same stone statue, which allowed a bird, to defecate on it and a lizard to crawl up it, that same level of steadfastness and compassion and love is what the female face of God is all about. This ability, to indulge us and to love us unconditionally, no matter what, indignities we perpetrate on her. And that the very planet itself, even Gaia herself, is such a manifestation. That Gaia herself, in spite of all the crap, that we do to her and continue to do to her, that she continues to feed us from her own body. What if?